It's time for your morning cup of cow shit. I still haven't gotten around to the episode of all the lies that the Park Service has told me personally because, as I've said, there's always something new coming out that you have to talk about. For example, today we're going to talk about PETA joining the ranks of all the other organizations that just bow down to the powers that be rather than actually showing some form of integrity. What we're going to do today is look at the response that PETA sent out to people who have been writing in regarding the elk that are slowly dying terrible deaths under the Park Service's watch. As we do this, I want you to think about how obvious it is that their response was cut and pasted from what the Park Service told them to say. Okay, let me quote from this email. Our contact with the National Park Service has assured us that while the herd at Tomales Point are indeed fenced off to keep them off the ranch lands and the livestock inn holders, they can be 100% certain that dehydration is not the cause of death for these elk. Thank you, PETA, for robotically deciding that these animals aren't suffering because of a technicality in an argument of exactly why they're dying. They go on to say that it is because of poor nutrition in the forage. People for the ethical treatment of animals. You just repeated the exact same thing that the Park Service says to everyone who writes in and expresses concern about animals that are slowly dying of whatever you want to call it. I don't care what you call it. Stop talking about water for a while because everyone gets distracted by the Park Service's denial that it has anything to do with water, while the Park Service does say that it's drought-related conditions. Drought-related conditions and lack of water. Is there a connection there? How about the fact that plants can't produce forage with nutrition without water nourishing the plants? But I digress. Whatever the cause of death is, these animals are trapped behind a fence. They cannot fight for their lives. They cannot move on to better forage. They cannot move on to find water. They cannot move on to escape from disease. Whatever is happening to them, they are prisoners. And as PETA said in their own email, they are prisoners for one reason and one reason only: profit of ranchers operating in a national seashore that we the people pay for. Now, a lot of you are saying the destructively obedient line of you got to work with your federal agencies, you've got to work in cooperation with each other for the greater good. No. What you need to do is think for yourselves, because their response not only contradicts reason, but is ludicrous. Let me continue with the quote. These are considered to be natural deaths. These are considered to be natural deaths by the Park Service, who are in the pockets of the ranchers. PETA, can you think for yourselves, please? Is that a natural death, to be trapped from being able to go and save yourself? Dear PETA, please describe in detail how allowing animals trapped behind a barrier, unable to get adequate food, forage, anything, slowly dying without a chance to help themselves, is considered ethical treatment of animals. Don't cut and paste what the Park Service told you to say. Don't repeat some crap about culture and ranching. Describe in detail how this slow suffering and death of animals is ethical. Does PETA support zoos, by the way? I don't follow PETA because they've done enough crappy stuff in history for me not to follow them. But, do they consider animals dying in zoos to be natural deaths? And it's not even that PETA decided that they think this is natural. They literally just supplied what the Park Service told them to say without doing any thinking or research of their own, as evidenced by this next line. Quote, please know that it is not practical for the staff to bring in water troughs, as these pose a health risk to the elk and any other animals who may drink from them due to the presence of bacteria that grows rapidly if the troughs are not thoroughly cleaned daily. They also pose a risk to smaller animals who may fall into them and drown. as the sides are too smooth to climb. Wow, where do I begin? How about the fact that the park's contingency plan that they came up with at the last minute after being confronted about not having a contingency plan is to bring in troughs of water. But then they told PETA to tell us that that's not a practical solution. It's the park's contingency plan, but the park says it's not practical. More evidence that the park had no intention whatsoever of ever helping the elk by bringing in water. But let's get to the really ridiculous parts of it. Bacteria in the water troughs. An accumulation of bacteria in the water troughs is the elk's problem. Dear PETA, have you looked at the water supply in the park? It's all bacteria. It's carcass-infested, bacteria-ridden mud puddles. And that's where there's even mud left. Most of them are just dry as a bone now. Hold on a second, PETA. Take a look behind the last rib and the spine. There's a drop of water there. I'm sure the elk would take that in a heartbeat over troughs of water that eventually accumulate bacteria. My God, how stupid is that response, that bacteria is a concern? Keep in mind this footage is from back in September of 2020 and conditions are only getting worse for these elk. I understand that animals are supposed to be thought of in a different category as we humans, but just to think about how ridiculous this is for a moment, put yourself out there in the elk's position and you're trapped behind that fence and it's getting hot and you're getting thirsty. What are you going to choose? A trough of water that has recently been filled with fresh water but might be accumulating bacteria, or this disgusting puddle of filth on the ground that is guaranteed to make you sick? One of the things that the Park Service tells people is that the necropsies showed that the animals had some systemic infections. Gee, something tells me that this water has something to do with that. And regarding animals falling in and dying in the troughs, have you considered the multitude of troughs that are scattered across all the ranch land for their cattle? Do we need to do a count of how many animals are falling into those and dying if this is a true concern? And then this mention about being cleaned daily. Are you pretending that you think ranchers clean their water troughs daily? Because that's a joke that I can't even laugh at that one. Go out and look at the conditions that these small organic farmers have their animals living in. They stand in their own feces half the time. All their food troughs are covered in feces. All of these water troughs scattered across the fields. No one's attending to them, except for when they initially put the water in there. And if they were to go and clean them, how do you do that? You would have to dump out all the water to get the bacteria that you scraped off the trough out, right? Which just adds to the incredible amount of waste of water that's already being wasted trying to hydrate cattle in a dying industry that's incredibly unsustainable. PETA, don't ever post one of those happy stories about people coming to the aid of an animal that falls off of a cliff or down into a well or a hole and make this big deal about the compassion of humans that come to the aid of that animal. Because this is even worse than those scenarios. These animals are trapped. These are endemic, iconic species in California, and the only reason that they are trapped is the willful intent of humans that are more interested in protecting the industry that's responsible for the eradication of native wildlife in the first place. PETA goes on to provide links to the facts on the Park Service's page, which of course the Park Service provided for PETA. And, you know, I mean, it's basically verbatim the same BS that they just wrote. So a lot of people don't like when you expose the person. They try to protect an identity. I say, if you are willing to sign your name to complete and utter rubbish in order to receive a paycheck, I think you need to own up to what you do for a living. Shame on you, Maura. Seriously. Look at yourself. Shame on you, PETA.